Welcome to the By Way of Commandment podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the finer points of his doctrine. Join us as we study the gospel through the scriptures and standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Welcome back, everyone, to the By Way of Commandment podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Ryder, and I am very excited to have with me Stephen Murphy of the channel Mormonism with the Murph. A very different channel from mine. If you're new to my channel, then hopefully this will give you a good taste of both of us. But what I think, Stephen, what I think you do very well, and thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What I think you do very well is you take the perspective of somebody who is almost sort of investigating the church with new eyes, or investigating the church from a fresh perspective, trying to be as objective as you can about various controversial historical topics, whether it's polygamy, whether it's Joseph Smith and the translation of the Book of Mormon, all these various topics that can be very controversial, that have really two sides to the story. And I really appreciate what you're doing with your channel and bringing guests on who are very knowledgeable experts on these various topics and just talking about the facts and then letting your audience kind of decide how they feel about them. So very different than my channel. Anybody who's known me for a long time knows that this channel is really kind of already, I guess, a TBM, true believing member channel. We talk about a lot of different topics. I love talking about the priesthood and the temple and things like that. I find very fascinating. But most of my viewers know that this channel is kind of for people who are already in it. They're already very committed to the church and the gospel of Jesus Christ as restored through Joseph Smith and all that. And we talk about topics that I think are only really appropriate to talk about with those who are kind of already in it. And you take a very different approach of talking to people about topics that someone even like myself might shy away from at times on the channel or in a public sphere, right?
No, my channel isn't it's not a devotional one, it's not a spiritual one. You know, I am a believer. I'm still in the church. I still have faith, but I try not to bring that into my channel too much. Obviously, you know, we all have a bias, and I don't hide the fact that I'm a member of the church, but that wasn't the motivation for me starting my channel. Wasn't to try to just build faith or to let's just look at everything that supports the church or talk about conference talks. And I think it's great that there's channels who have different voices and that want to focus on different things. But as you said, I'm more sort of diving into kind of controversial things in church history, you know, do with the Book of Mormon, and to try to do an objective and fair analysis and looking at the critics' arguments and evidence and perspectives, and also look at some of the apologetic responses and faithful perspectives, and try to be sort of neutral and unbiased and try to talk to experts as well. So that's sort of what my channel is about.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you do have quite a few experts who have come on your channel. It's actually really cool to see.
It's been really cool for
how
me.
Many and they don't all necessarily agree or fall on the same side of the spectrum.
No.
I believe you had Dan Vogel on not too long ago. You've had more recently, you've had Brian Hales on, who's done I think a fantastic job breaking down all the historical evidence for polygamy in the church. We have a wide variety of guests that you've had on. Jim Bennett, who I absolutely love. I think he takes a perspective that is, I don't really like to use this word very often, but nuanced. Because I think the words become kind of clickbaity or buzzwordy. But he does have a very, I think, unique perspective on a lot of these controversial topics. He famously wrote the rebuttal to the CES letter, which I would encourage everybody to read. If you haven't even read the CES letter, don't worry. If you read Jim Bennett's response to it, you'll essentially be reading it twice, because he almost kind of quotes it verbatim throughout his
He does. He
rebuttal.
responds to every single issue and all the questions are in it. So if you read that, you'll know what all the questions are in the CS letter. And our 4-part interview was, I don't think we talked about every single issue, but we try to cover most of the topics and most of the big questions and have a discussion on it. And yeah, he's a great guy, and kudos to him for confronting it. Responding to the CS letter is not a task many people want to do.
Well, to be quite honest, reading his response was a Herculean task because it's not short and quick. It's a read, and
Mm-hmm.
you need to devote some time to read it and get through it. And the CES letter, I think, is one of those things that has um I don't want to say, I don't want to give more credibility to it than I think it deserves, because I think that there are some very faulty reasoning in the CES letter by Jeremy Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's caused a lot of confusion and doubt in members who have read it. And so I love that we have people like Jim Bennett who have given very thoughtful, drawn out responses to it, trying to address every point of the letter. And you may still read it and come away thinking that you don't fully agree with Jim Bennett's take, or that you think that maybe Jeremy Reynolds, who wrote the CS letter, that maybe he made some good points.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly fine. But I love the fact that we have people like Jim Bennett who are willing to tackle such a Herculean task.
Yeah. No, we need more of those faithful voices, and because people they're wanting answers to their tough questions. The CS letter. I don't think that everything in there is good research or good scholarship, but there are still things that I still struggle with, and I'm navigating my way through. There's lots of friends and family members who I know who have a lot of the same issues, and they're looking for places to go to find faithful answers or to better understand some of these issues.
Yeah. I would point them to your channel.
Well,
So
that's part of what motivated me beginning it.
I think there's a number of channels out there that do kind of something similar to what you're doing. They take but they definitely have their bias is more front and center. And
Yeah.
that's not a bad thing. That's not what I'm not saying
No.
bias in a pejorative way. I'm saying they're very upfront with their motivations for why they're doing what they're doing. And I think what you've done is allowed your own personal biases to take a back seat and just let the experts speak on the topic and ask the probing questions. And you do a very good job of asking questions from both a believer's point of view and a non-believer's point of view.
Yeah.
And some of those questions are hard to answer. Um, they're
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as much as we would love it, um, we don't have a perfectly clean answer for every question. It just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Um, and
I
I
agree.
and I think that the sooner that we as members of the church can kind of realize that, then the sooner I think our apologetics will get better.
Yeah. I, I totally agree. There's so much more complexity, messiness, and me going into starting my channel, I wanted to try to eliminate my bias to an extent. Obviously, I'm not rejecting spiritual experiences or things that have caused me to believe, but going down this journey, I feel like um, in more of an intellectual pursuit, I need to set it to one side as I'm sort of looking objectively and analyzing sources and evidence. Um, because I noticed, similar to what you said, there are certain YouTube channels that I loved, like Saints Unscripted, or there's one LDS Truth Claims, Latter-day Saints Q&A, and I would listen and read like Fair Mormon and Book Mormon Central, but then I also listened to like some critical podcasts or material, and sometimes I felt like they were focusing on the information that supported their position, and they weren't fully answering what each other was saying at times. And I almost wish there was a channel where you could bring them both together, or you could get critics and apologists to really discuss things together. And partly what I was doing is, as I was trying to figure some things out, like I've had more friends and family members leave and bring up a lot of the same issues that I struggle with in my faith crisis. And I felt like I just need to confront these things, try to look at it objectively. And so I made a big presentation on the first vision of like all the critical things I could think of, looking at all the apologetics. I, put it all together. And then I thought this was a lot of work for no reasons. I was like, I might as well like record myself going through this and maybe do a YouTube channel that tries to objectively and fairly looking at both sides. And then people can sort of come to their own conclusions, and it's because it's not right if you only share one side of the information or one part that supports your position, but you omit or leave out anything that might go against. And that goes for both sides. Critics and apologists can both be guilty of that, because it's confirmation bias. And that's something I'm trying to eliminate as I'm trying to figure out and come to some sort of a consensus on these issues.
So let's talk about that. I want to kind of ask you, where did your faith journey, your faith crisis kind of start? Where, because I've listened to your channel for quite some time. I've heard you talk about your faith journey. You're very open about it. And it seems, as far as I can piece together, it seems like you grew up in a fairly conservative church going household. You served a mission.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you had some really good experiences on your mission.
Yeah.
So at what point did you start to have some doubts or questions that caused you to maybe break down your worldview?
Yeah. So for me, I grew up with really strong faith, very orthodox home. I felt like I had a testimony and spiritual experiences. So I could have said like I felt like I really knew the church was true. Joe Smith was a prophet, the Book of Mormon's true, and just everything about the gospel and the church was just beautiful and amazing. And we talked about this off air, that my experience was just everything was just so perfect. And it was after my mission, I had a family member, one of my sisters, who had left the church, and she had just issues with Joseph Smith and church history and just the modern church in general. And I wanted to help bring her back to the church and resolve some of her concerns. I never really went looking for anything critical or antagonistic before, because we've been sort of cautioned, stay away from anti-Mormon literature, or it's anti-Mormon lies that will destroy your testimony. And to be honest, I didn't really know what I hadn't heard, if that makes sense. I didn't know what I was missing out on.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know. And she just started sharing with me some of her concerns with things in church history and with Joseph Smith. And whenever I first started learning about it, I was like, there's no way this can be true, because this is so different to the faithful narrative that I grew up with. But then she was like showing me, sources that sort of confirm things, like the history of the church, Journal of Discourses, even the church's own gospel topics essays, which maybe I was aware of, but I hadn't really read through them. I started listening to like a lot of critics and, wanted to get my hands on as much of the critical information as I could, but to try to answer it, because I was very curious, I was very open-minded. And then I started to just have loads of doubts about church history, about the Book of Mormon, about, Joseph Smith and the first vision and polygamy, and just all this new research and all these controversial things that I didn't know about for, the first 22 years growing up in the church. Within, the space of a few months, my testimony just was crumbling with just all these doubts and all these things that I couldn't reconcile. And I kind of looked into apologetics a little bit to try to answer some of the questions, but I was just overcome by all of the, the critical information, like everything in the CS letter, and watching like Mormon stories and listening to really prominent critics of the church. And I think it was the fact that going to like places like Fair Mormon or like the Gospel Topics essays, while they're trying to provide faithful answers, they're validating a lot of these things, which so yeah, I kind of lost my faith and lost my testimony because it was just, I think a lot of people can feel almost a slight betrayal that there was lots of things that were maybe either hidden or just the church wasn't fully forthright about. At least that I grew up with just a very literal fundamentalist view of the gospel, scripture, prophets, the life of Joseph Smith.
Right.
So it was very hard to reconcile the things I was learning.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, the picture they have of church history and Joseph Smith is very much in line with, I think, the video that came out 15, maybe 20 years now at this
The
point,
Joseph
the
Smith movie,
Joseph Smith
yeah,
movie, right?
yeah,
It's a very clean picture of his life, a very faithful adaptation of sort of the highlights of his life.
yes,
And I don't mean highlights in terms of like spirituality and stuff. I mean highlights in terms of kind of the um,
like events
major
and
event in his life, right?
yeah,
Um, I love that movie. Um, I when I saw it as a kid, I actually saw it in the Temple Visitor Center in Laie, Hawaii, and I thought it was great. I had a friend with me at the time who was with us, who's not a member of the church, and I remember we went to the Temple Visitor Center. We're walking around because we had time that day before we had to be somewhere later. And so we had a few hours to kill. And we're like, well, we're just down the road from the temple. Let's go check out the visitor center and stuff. And my friend was agnostic. And he was like, okay, whatever, let's go. And so we went and we watched the movie. And he was just kind of like, okay, like not convinced at all by it.
right.
And I was like, oh, wasn't that awesome? He's like, eh. He's like, I
Hmm.
can see if this is what happened, I can see why you guys like really like
You
this
Joseph
guy,
Smith that way, yeah,
but I I don't feel any like attachment to it or whatever. And he was very new to just religion in general. He wasn't grown up. He didn't grow up in a religious home. His whole family was agnostic, and so he just didn't really have a strong bias um or understanding of really any sort of Christian denomination. So
yeah,
he didn't have an anchor point really to kind of um, to use as kind of a reference. And so this was very, very different than anything he had ever seen or heard before. But we're going around the temple, and there's the Christus statue when you walk into the visitor center, and there's a little presentation where it's kind of like the creation of the world, and the Christus is basically the voice of Christ comes on the speaker and is explaining the creation and how he loves his children and stuff. And I remember after we were wandering around the visitor center, we watched the video, we did a couple of the little things that we got around to the Christus, and we watched the little presentation. It was just us three. It was me, my mom, and my friend. And he was just like awestruck. Like it was, I look at it now as this might have been one of the few, or maybe one of the only spiritual experiences he probably ever had in his life at that point. Because he he could not stop talking about that afterwards. It was very impactful for him. Um, and it kind of was a little bit of a faith builder for me. But it all came back to Christ and what was the message that was being presented.
right.
Was we are all God's children. I created you in my image. I love you, and I want you to return to live with me again. And that was the message. That it's just a very Christian message that didn't have anything really to do necessarily with the restored church. Um, but I could tell that had an impact on him, and so even at a young age, I think I was exposed to um, people who had very different worldviews, but who are still
Yeah.
able to feel the spirit or have a spiritual experience,
Mm,
and watch it in real time was kind of faith building for me as well.
it's cool. Yeah. No, it's interesting how different things can touch different people, and they can be spiritually moved and impacted by different aspects of the gospel.
Yeah. And but back to the point, the restoration movie of Joseph Smith movie, right? Did
I
nothing
love
for
that
him.
movie. I watched it with every investigator that was going to get baptized. I didn't have too many baptisms, but I must have watched it at least half a dozen times, 2 dozen times on my mission. And that was kind of the way I viewed church history. I remember I read, I think it's the book Our Heritage. Scenes
Yeah.
hadn't come out when I was on my mission, but I read that. And yeah, that was sort of, I wasn't big into church history. Like I found the Doctrine and Covenants year in seminary kind of interesting. But yeah, I had a very simplistic understanding of church history.
Yeah, no, I did too. I didn't look into church history until probably after my mission, maybe a little bit during my mission, but not too much. It was very much the traditional um sort of picture,
Yeah.
the Joseph Smith movie picture of church history as and our heritage and a few other things that I had read. But I think the first thing I ever read that was maybe a little bit more um maybe unbiased was Rough Stone Rolling,
Yes.
and I
Yeah.
read it because I had a number of people I had run into on my mission, including companions who had left the church because of that book.
Wow.
And so I went into it thinking there's something seriously wrong if people are reading this book and leaving the church, saying Joseph Smith's a fraud, he's not a prophet, church history is bogus, you know, all these different claims. One of the big ones I think I heard the most was seer stone in a hat,
Hmm.
things like that, treasure digging, right?
Yeah.
There are some of these big claims in the book, and I was on my mission, kind of at the latter end of my mission, and I'm hearing people leave the church over it. And
Which
so
is
I
amazing because it's quite a neutral book, but I read it more part of my reconstructing and coming back, and I actually found Rough Stone Ruling. I thought it was good history, good scholarship. It did talk about some of the troubling things in church history, but I found it more lean slightly more faithful, not as much as like the Saints books, but maybe because I really dived into really critical books. But it's amazing how people, if they're first learning about some of the issues, I can understand why that book may have had that impact.
so I picked it up on my mission. We had a library close to our apartment, so I went to the library one day at lunch, and I found the book and I started reading, and I got through maybe the first couple chapters, and I put it back and I was like, well, this was garbage. And I hated it. Uh I went into it thinking um that this book must just be the devil because it's leading people out of the church. Um and so
Which
I
is
went
funny because Richard Bushman, he's a faithful, Latter-day Saint scholar and historian. He wouldn't
right.
be like antagonistic. But it's funny that that was your view on it or
Oh,
how you
I,
felt.
it was I was very much looking for what is wrong with this book rather
Yeah.
than letting it do the talking, and letting Richard Bushman kind of just present his information, his research. And so the first couple things that I came across within those few chapters that didn't mesh with my understanding of church history, I was like, well, that must be wrong. That must be wrong. This guy is just, he just must not know much about the church, or he's whatever. I didn't know who Richard Bushman was. I didn't
Right.
know he
Yeah.
was a member of the church. And I believe even in the book itself, he doesn't talk about himself. He doesn't talk about his membership in the church. It's all presenting his research into church history. And so I didn't know who he was. And I read maybe the first two chapters and I slammed the book closed, put it back on the shelf. And I was like, well, that was garbage. That was a waste of 20 minutes that I'll never get back. But I can see just from those few chapters why people would have such a hard time with it, because I was having a hard time with it.
Oh yeah. And I can think back to when I first like I remember on a mission, somebody told me about the seer stone in the hat. I'd never heard of it before and I just dismissed it. Somebody talked to me about Joe Smith's polygamy. I obviously knew about polygamy in Utah, but I thought things they were saying about Joseph Smith, and they were kind of embellishing things, you know, but I didn't know about Joe Smith's polygamy. And whenever my family member was first telling me their concerns, I was like, well, that's not true. Where are you getting your information? Where's the source for that? And it was whenever she provided me, look, this is from a church source corroborating. That's when I was kind of like, oh, I had to wrestle with the fact that this isn't just, you know, an anti-Mormon made up lie.
Right. Which you having served a mission, I'm sure have heard your fair share of just straight up falsehoods about the church.
Yeah, I didn't encounter really much sort of anti. Like most of the people I encountered with would have just bashed with us, like if they're Jehovah Witness or evangelical. I never really. It was only those two instances where someone brought up the seer stone, and we had a neighbor who sort of had a go at us about Joe Smith's polygamy, and that was basically it. So I didn't encounter much critical information on the church on my mission, which a lot of people do on their missions. I was quite surprised I didn't. Like, obviously, people would have said, like, oh, you're in a cult and things like that, but nobody well versed on troubling things in church history who presented me with loads of, like, no one brought up like the CS letter or anything like that.
Yeah, I think for me, the rough stone rolling was kind of it at the time. CS letter hadn't come out yet.
Yeah.
So the big one was rough stone rolling, and then there were a few other things. I think John DeLynn was starting to get more popular, but this was kind of early on in his more public
And he was more
whatever you want to call
neutral
it.
in the beginning before his excommunication. He would have been
Right.
like, he would have brought on sort of, you know, believers and more faithful historians and critics as well, but he was probably more neutral at the start.
Yeah, and I think along the way he's gotten more critical.
Yeah,
I listened to some of his podcasts now recently, like the one with Stephen Pinecker of Mormon book reviews and stuff like that. I've listened
he's
to
a
some of
great guy.
those. I'd love to talk to him too. I think he's a very interesting story. Um, but
Really nice
yeah,
guy. We're good friends. And he's always looking for because he's got a Mormon media review section of his podcast, so he's always looking for different channels. So I can put in a good word. He's a great guy.
well, that'd be cool. I mean, the more the merrier. I think he's a really interesting guy. I love his channel.
Yeah,
Very different perspective on things, and a
very
very different.
friendly, very
Yes,
friendly to the
yes.
church.
See, that's the thing is, you come across some of these channels and you don't always know what you're going to get. It's like you're playing roulette. Are you going to get somebody who's just totally critical of the church and hates the church and wants to do everything they can to defame it and whatever, or are you going to get a super faithful channel, and you don't really know. And so the first time I came across Mormon book reviews, I'm like, is this like an offshoot of God Loves Mormons or one of those channels
Right,
that
yeah.
hates the church? And I listened to I can't remember who it was, but I listened to one of his videos and I was like, oh no, this guy's like way nice and obviously not a member, but has a lot of nice things to say, and he's not here to make us feel stupid or make us feel like
No.
we're wrong or whatever. Like that's not his end game. And so after a few videos of his, I'm like, okay, I'm hooked. This guy's awesome.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to hear different perspectives and different voices. I totally have respect for active members who feel like I only want to focus on all the faithful side. I don't want to hear anything critical. And I totally get that. And that's totally fine. Um, for somebody who's more open-minded or kind of objective, I think it's important to hear different perspectives. Because if all you listen to is just, say, the critical perspective, which was similar to me in the first part of my faith crisis, I was so heavily influenced by just that perspective. And that may be the correct perspective, but it's important to look at the faithful perspectives, maybe a more nuanced, neutral perspective. Then you can take it all in, and then you can see which one do I think is the best sort of interpretation or take on things.
Yeah. So going back to your own faith crisis,
Yeah.
do you think, because you were spending months just researching all the critical material, was there anything in specific that like broke the camel's back for you, or was it just kind of the overwhelming amount of information on all different topics?
It was a bit of both. I think it was definitely the sum of just all of the, all of the issues, like similarities between like the temple endowment and masonry, the Book of Abraham, Book of Mormon anachronisms and 19th century elements in the text. Joe Smith's polygamy, I think, was a huge one that for me really called into question his character of Joseph Smith, and was he being like a righteous prophet, or was he just libido driven and being a sexual predator? And I was very overcome by the evidence and the critics' perspectives on it. The multiple accounts of the first vision, that was one that was very important to me, and I was really overcome by the differences in the accounts, and I sort of sided with the critics that, oh, I think he's just changing his story or embellishing it with his theology. And prophets was a big one. Whenever I learned about some of the past teachings from certain prophets that aren't in harmony with church doctrine, or which are just very troubling and harmful, I think that was one of the big things that was, I think, the final straw whenever I researched that. Yeah, so it was kind of, there was a few things which were obviously the biggest issues, but it was a sum of a lot of them. So by the time I left, I was pretty well versed in most of the issues.
So, which this might be a weird question to ask, but which of the big issues that you came across that you struggled with the most,
Yeah.
which ones do you still have some reservations on, or still are working through, or have you kind of come to a resolution for a lot of them?
That's a good question. So part of um like briefly, my faith journey, I had experiences that brought me back to the church. Mostly it was a spiritual experience, or feeling I received a spiritual revelation, and which I interpreted as God telling me to come back and that this is true. And I at least came back believing again in the foundational claims of the church and the restoration, but I still had all of the books on my shelf, and I've continued to have maybe some faith struggles and doubts over the years. I've been exploring apologetics, but this channel is me this is me really fully confronting it and coming to terms with some things. And some issues aren't as big an issue as what they were. So I did a big series on Joe Smith's first vision, and I read Stephen Harper's book, and I read through all the accounts, and some of the issues I had with it then aren't as big an issue now. And I can sort of see like there's more information, and a lot of it is just a different interpretation someone can take. There's some things which do still bother me. The Book of Abraham and aspects of Joe Smith's polygamy are things which still are troubling for me. And some of the things that prophets have said in the past are still things that I wrestle with. But I've also found some things which have helped, almost like been more faithful evidences that I didn't take into account when I first went through my faith crisis. Things to do with the Book of Mormon, and like Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert, or like textual things like Hebraisms or chiasmus, or things to do like the Book of Enoch parallels, and ancient temple rituals and the temple endowment. So I've been learning more in research of things that also support some things, but there's definitely still things that I'm navigating my way through and trying to reconcile and figure out, aligning the spiritual faith and testimony with, the intellectual side.
So one of the things I talk about quite often with I teach the high school kids in Sunday school, and I also teach elders quorum. But one of the things I talk about quite often with the high school kids is like, one of the commandments Jesus gave was to love God with all your heart, might, mind, and strength. That's the premier commandment that supersedes all commandments.
Yeah.
We can't fully do that if we're only giving him our soul. we have to give him our heart, we have to give him our mind, we have to be willing to study things out. I think the way I put it for them is um, to love God with our mind means to study the gospel from an intellectual perspective and be willing to give the devil its due, so to speak.
Mm.
We need to be able to study sort of both sides of an issue and learn as much of the facts as we can and be willing to take that to the Lord and
Yeah.
invest our studies um and give that over to him. But we can't do that if we're not willing to study it, or if we're
Yes.
only willing to study certain aspects of it that we already agree with,
Yeah.
or that confirm our biases. And um I can tell you that working with the youth and Sunday school and in young men's, I worked in young men's for a long time. If you allow them the room to ask the questions that might be hard, or the
Yeah.
questions that they perceive are hard questions for them to get through, and you give them the space to ask the questions and to talk about it, um, they're much more willing to engage and to look into these topics and study them out more than if you just shut it down and say, well, you must be coming across some anti literature, and so you should stop reading that, or you should stop listening to that.
And that's kind
um
of what I was getting whenever I was first in my faith crisis and having doubts and questions. And even since I've been doing my channel, I've had a priesthood leader tell me to pretty much stop, stop researching, stop questioning. It could lead you to lose your testimony. Just sort of get back in line and do the basics. And that might work for some people. And I said to him, like, I tried doing that for a time, and it's almost like I feel like I need to confront these things. I almost feel like that's what God would want me to do as well, because I was very close over this past year to feeling at one point that I can't make this work anymore. There's too many issues, and I just need to jump ship and throw in the towel. And I had sort of a prayer where I was annoyed at God, pleading for some sort of help, and feeling this impression that, like, God didn't want me to just jump ship and leave, but that you need to confront these things, that they can't be left on the shelf. You're gonna have to explore them, but to include me in the journey, so to speak, and try to be balanced, try to take it slow, really try to be objective, because a lot of people can think that, like, members only stay in because they want it to be true. But there's also, I have to check myself, because there's a part of me that was also very tempted to, life would be a lot easier not following the church and the gospel. That makes sense.
sure, yeah.
There's it's high demand, and I have to check that I'm not just wanting to leave and then just finding something and that's caused me to want to jump ship. So taking things slow, really trying to examine my intents and trying to make it a process of both your heart and your mind, I think is important. But telling people, yeah, don't research, don't question, don't study about things like that. Like, I think back to when you read Joe Smith's first vision and the wrestle and struggle he was having about which church he should join, and investigating them and going to his Bible and pondering and then turning to God in prayer. Like, I feel like that's an example to us of what we should do with the issues and questions we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of the term Israel a lot. um a few years ago, President Nelson came out with his talk where he talked about Israel means, let God prevail,
Right.
um and that's true, but uh there's another definition of the term Israel that's given that I think is meant most literally in the Hebrew Bible, and that is wrestle with God. He
Yeah.
Jacob receives the name Israel after his wrestle with the angel of the Lord.
Yeah.
Um, and I have thought for a very long time that if we don't wrestle with God, then we're operating at a very superficial level. Whether we're a critic of the church or we're all in, if we don't break through that first level, so to speak, of understanding of the gospel,
Yeah, like
and try to
simplicity.
learn more, then we'll never truly become equipped with the knowledge and testimony necessary to truly engage with the Lord. I think there's something to be said for the spiritual gift of believing. There are people who just feel it and just believe.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that's a beautiful gift, and I wish more members of the church were willing to give the benefit of the doubt, or willing to um, put in sort of the spiritual work to recognize the Spirit when it's present.
yes,
Um, but there's something to be said for those who are willing to go the mile and wrestle with God over some of the things that trouble them, or some of the things that they have confusion over, that they don't have a clear cut answer for. Um, and I come back to this term all the time. Anytime I think of something that might be difficult to go through, or any topic that might be difficult to answer, it's like, well, we're we're trying to become Israel. We're trying to become a covenant people of God, and Israel means to wrestle with God. It's inherent in the title of who we are trying to become, that we will have our struggles and wrestles with God.
yeah,
And so if and I think too, back to like Doctrine and Covenants 121, Joseph Smith's in Liberty Jail, and we have these couple of sections of Doctrine and Covenants that come out of that experience, and the Lord is like, look, yeah, things suck right now. You're in prison. It's not fun. I never said this life was going to be perfectly easy and fun.
yeah,
You're going to have to struggle. And that might mean you're going to have to ask yourself the deep down questions that may cause you some doubts here or there. But if you can take those seriously and then bring them to me, lay your concerns on my shoulders, I will bear you up and we'll get through it together. But if you aren't willing to go the mile and really work through this life and struggle a bit and
yeah,
take it seriously, then you will only ever have a superficial knowledge of me and my gospel and what I have in store for you.
yeah.
Um,
I so
when
agree.
when we look at scripture, I think we look at these really faithful examples of people in scripture, and like, man, if I could just have faith like that guy, or if I could have like this experience, Nephi saw a vision, Lehi had the vision of the tree of life, and the brother of Jared saw the finger of the Lord. We have all these kind of like images in our head of what it means to be like a really faithful example of a faithful person,
Yeah,
and we kind of almost omit or forget the struggles these people went through that led them to those moments. I mean,
yeah. Often before the miracle, there's the crisis.
right,
There's a problem that comes before the miracle,
right.
and we
Faith
don't like
precedes
the
the miracle,
crisis.
right? And I think, yeah, faith precedes the miracle. And I think you can't truly exercise faith until you've been presented with something that requires faith to get through.
Yeah,
Um, so you mentioned some of your own spiritual experiences you had that kind of were a confirmation to you that you needed to stay in the church and let God kind of help you through this.
yeah,
Um, I often see people who have left the church, um, who maybe don't have those kinds of experiences, and I often wonder if they had put themselves out there to really try and study things out, or to really take their concerns to the Lord, um, would they still be in the church? They might still struggle with things, but would they still be here? And that's a question that I don't have an answer to. I don't know.
yeah. Because I can't speak for other people. I've
Right,
heard stories of people who probably have felt like they've done very heartfelt prayers and saw a spiritual answer, and maybe they felt like they didn't get one. I know for me, whenever I first left the church and lost my faith, I'm sure I did pray about it, but there is a part of me that had almost come to the conclusion it's not true. And it would have been, it was almost hard to feel open to a spiritual answer to convince me otherwise. And yeah, whenever I was out of the church and inactive, I was still open minded, that I was open to new evidence, but I was 100% certain it wasn't true. And it was almost like nothing would have really convinced me except for maybe like a vision of the angel. And there's experiences and things with apologetics and people sharing with me experience that at least caused me to open my mind again. Didn't convince me, but it caused me to open up and think the possibility I could be wrong, or the possibility maybe there's more to this issue. Maybe the CS letter isn't everything there is to know on these issues. And yeah, it caused me to open up my heart, my mind again, to go to God in sincere fasting and prayer, laying all my issues and my concerns sort of on the altar before God, but really desiring to follow his will, truth, and whatever was the right path, and that I would hearken to the spiritual answer. But I felt like I really needed a big spiritual answer, because I think a lot of people can lose trust in spiritual experiences. They can reinterpret their experiences or the spiritual feelings they had growing up in the church, that, oh, those were just feelings or elevation emotion based upon a whitewashed narrative, but those aren't reliable sources of truth. And I think that's one of the biggest things is, and I was in that same boat where I lost faith in spiritual experiences. I didn't think they were reliable. And that can be a hard thing for people to overcome. And despite feeling that some of the experiences I had were very profound and quite powerful, and to me did seem like God answering me, and it still required faith. And I wrestled with the experiences. I wrestled with, what about this opposing evidence, or all these issues, all these concerns? And the way I sort of see faith, like if this church is true and God is really there, I feel like, and the scriptures talk about like opposition in all things, and I believe that there's going to be opposition in everything, including there's going to be opposing reasons to believe. There's going to be opposing evidence. You're going to have faith promoting experiences, and you're going to have some experiences that test your faith, might shake it at times. And you almost have to make a decision. Do you hold to the faith promoting ones? Do you choose to have faith, or do you choose to give in to your doubts and the reasons for not believing? And it's not always beautiful. It's not like the simplistic sort of narrative I grew up in primary or in youth, that every single prayer that you pray for will come true. Every single prompting you have will be manifested the way you thought it would, or every single thing in scripture, what a prophet says, is true in the mind and will of God. And in some ways, I wish I could go back to the very simple faith that I had, because it was a lot easier and I didn't have to wrestle and process troubling things. But I've become more, I feel like it's more mature faith. It's more thoughtful, more refined. And in some ways, I feel like my testimony is not as strong as what it was. But if you think of the shelf analogy, my first shelf just completely broke with all the books. And although this time, I've still got a lot of the books, but the shelf is still there. And there's times where it's like, oh, I think it's gonna break. And then it's like, God will put in another screw just to keep it there. But it's not looking good, the shelf. And that's sort of how I sort of see my faith journey and my wrestle with God as I've been trying to navigate through things. And I feel like when it's been close to breaking, I've sort of turned to God again for help or answers. And it's almost like I've seen God's hand. It's helped me to continue to have faith and not just throw in the towel or jump ship. And yeah, I feel like faith, as you said, like it's a wrestle and it's a relationship with God, and it's not easy.
No, and I don't think it was ever meant to be. I think if our faith is easy, then it's not It's not very well grounded.
Yeah. I
There,
think like faith isn't to have a perfect knowledge. The scriptures teach that. And I don't think it's wrong for people to say, I know it's true. I know this, I know that. Because I would have shared those things in the past and felt like I had such strong spiritual conviction, and there would have been no reason not to believe. Whereas now I feel like my faith has become more I believe, or I hope, or I have faith in this. I don't have certainty, so I have more epistemic humility. But I don't see that anywhere that's any less powerful faith versus knowing. And sometimes we can hear it in testimony. People will say, like, oh, I don't just believe, I know. And that's even more powerful. But there was a time in my life where my faith was really struggling and there was loads of problems. It was before I married my wife, and there was just so much complications because we needed a visa, and because she was from Mexico and it was during COVID, and all these barriers to getting to Mexico. And I had like this spiritual impression that like it was after a conference talk by President Nelson about faith to move mountains.
Mhm.
And I felt like this was the right decision to get married. You're gonna get there. There's gonna be loads of obstacles, but like have faith, pretty much. Put your trust in God, and He'll get you there. And my faith at times was like really shaking, like it was close to like being completely destroyed. And just having a tiny bit of faith, like this, the size of a mustard seed, and that miracles can happen. And that to me was a testimony that if you can just exercise whatever faith you have, um, God can still answer prayers and still bring to pass miracles, and it's still powerful. You don't have to know with absolute certainty.
Yeah, and I always term faith as like a verb. It's an action word. It's to act
Yeah.
upon the light and knowledge that you already have.
Yes, I like that.
Um, and so when we look at like Alma 32 is kind of our big faith chapter in the Book of Mormon, or Hebrews 11, or whatever it might be that kind of defines faith. I feel like sometimes um, the way that we view faith is just like, well, it's what I believe in, and I don't see that at all. It's acting upon what you believe in. And
Yeah.
I'm actually doing the lectures on faith right now for my channel. I'm going through every lecture on faith. And one of the things that is, um, I think, really important that I hope comes across in the lectures and in the videos I'm doing about them is faith is to exercise, or to act out your belief,
Yeah.
and you have to be willing to act out your belief if you're ever going to strengthen that faith. Um and that we have this all throughout scriptures. It's in Isaiah, it's in the Book of Mormon, this idea of line upon line, precept upon precept. um to me, that's talking about faith, and faith and knowledge. We kind of think of faith and knowledge as like two opposing things, um and I don't. I see knowledge as the fullness of faith. And
Mm.
so if we use the model that's given in the scriptures of line upon line, faith is to exercise uh our our faculties, our energy, our behaviors, all upon the foundation of what we believe, or what light and knowledge we have received. So if we have this much light and knowledge and we act upon it, it will grow. We'll learn more. And if we keep
Right.
that
Yeah.
process line upon line, eventually we will come to a fullness of faith, or a fullness of knowledge. And
Yeah.
for most people, I think the fullness of knowledge on certain things won't happen until the next life. I think that's
Yeah.
kind of generally understood, that we won't truly know certain things like with 100% certainty in this life. And that's
Reminds me
okay.
of the scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants that talks about like that which is of God is light, and if you continue with God, you'll receive more light, and it will grow brighter and brighter until the perfect day, as you said. Well, you'll have almost like a fullness of light and knowledge and understanding. But if you continue with God, to grow that faith, that you can receive more light and more faith and knowledge.
Yeah, it's like a dimmer switch. We just, as we continue to act out our faith, little by little, we can increase the dial and the light will grow a little bit brighter, a little bit brighter. And there are times when we can decrease in faith and that dial gets dimmer. Um, I think, Alma 32 talks about if you can have no more than a desire to believe and let that desire to work in you.
Yeah.
That works both ways. If we have a desire to believe and to let that belief grow in us, to act out our belief in faith, we can do the opposite. If we have no more than a desire to not believe, then we'll look for things to not believe and we'll go down the opposite direction. So
Yeah.
I think that's important to understand that we maybe overlook sometimes, but
Our desires.
it all comes back down to our desires. Do we have a desire to follow God or to um I'm very careful when I say is our desire to follow God and not necessarily to follow the church or President Nelson, though I think as a TBM, a true believing member, I would say that the church, the purpose of the church and the purpose of the prophets and apostles is to point us to God. It's to point us to Jesus Christ and help
Yeah.
us to better understand how to have a relationship with him. But ultimately, we're trying to point ourselves to God. We're orienting ourselves towards God. And if we have no more than a desire to just follow God, even if for a time that means we struggle with certain aspects of church history or certain doctrines that we don't quite agree with or don't understand, um, as long as our desire is to go wherever God wants us to go and we're seeking a constant relationship with him and acting in faith and in good faith, whatever it is that our knowledge level is, whatever our faith level is, if
Yeah.
we're acting in good faith, then I think we will all eventually we'll be okay. I think is the main message. I think because from a perspective of somebody who's very much all in, we might see somebody like yourself when you were going through your faith struggles as well. He's just become apostate. He's listening to all the anti-material. There's no saving him.
Yeah.
And
Separating the sheep from the goats, own,
right,
you know,
right,
own
you're
what's
an
that scripture?
apostate.
Even the very elect will be deceived, and yeah, Satan's got
Right.
his heart. And
And I think, and I'll be honest, I felt like that for a long time growing up in a very traditional Orthodox home, um, serving a mission, coming
I
across
think as
people.
well, um, like I would have said it with my sister, you would have almost tried to find reasons for them losing their faith. Um, you wouldn't say that they've got maybe legitimate issues or concerns. You would almost try to say like, oh, they must not be following the keeping the commandments, or they're not reading their scriptures or praying, or they've been offended, or their sin, almost as a way to like legitimize maybe genuine issues or concerns that they may have.
Yeah, and I will admit I think there are times where I still somewhat feel that way, depending upon the person and the context.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think I've done myself a service in trying to not be so quick uh
Judge.
to judge in that way and to try and better understand where people are coming from.
Yeah.
And I hope that that's been beneficial, not just for me, but I hope that's been beneficial for my relationships with people. Time will tell, but I there is very much a part of me that still will look at somebody who's struggling with something and say, well, are they keeping the commandments? Do they even pray? I mean, do they even read their scriptures? I
Yeah.
mean, are they doing any of the things that we would suggest to somebody who's struggling to build a solid foundation from which to build on? Um, and that kind of brings me to a question I have for someone like yourself who's been in and out and have seen
Mm-hmm.
both sides of it. do you see a faith crisis? I'm using the umbrella term faith crisis. Do you see it as like a spectrum of um how do I don't know exactly the right way to say this, and I don't want it to come off as condescending or rude or anything. I hope nobody takes it this way, but like the difference between a real faith crisis and a fake one. Like because often I see this people who are one end of the spectrum who have very legitimate concerns, things
Yeah,
that have been brought to their attention, that have broken their shelf or have completely changed their worldview, and they have no idea what to do about it. And it's like it's happening to them, and they don't know what to do,
yeah.
and it truly causes them to struggle, and it's a real struggle. And they're trying to make heads and tails of it. And then there's the opposite end of the spectrum of a faith crisis where it's people who I think are maybe already kind of on their way out looking for reasons to not have to be a member of
To
the church anymore.
justify it.
Right.
Hmm.
They're trying to justify it. Do you see it that way? Do you see that there's kind of that spectrum there? Or do you feel that even those people on the other end of the spectrum who are trying to justify things, do you see them as kind of more in line with people who are more open about their honest struggles, and maybe are just more private about what they're really struggling with?
That's a good question. And obviously, I don't know everyone's individual experiences. I know my experience, and I usually try to give people the benefit of the doubt. You can always be suspicious of is there other reasons they want to leave. For the most part, I think, and faith crises are different. Like, although I went through a faith crisis and it caused me to leave the church, I've heard some people say because you didn't leave the church, you didn't go through a faith crisis, and that's not true. Like, a faith crisis doesn't have to lead you out of the church. And it's not for me to say to anyone else, you did go through a faith crisis or you didn't. Everyone's faith crisis can look different. The issues people struggle with can be different. Someone's faith crisis might be more to do with church history. Someone else's might be more to do with things to do with God in general. Um, and some people, it may just be they struggle with it for a few weeks, or it may be months or years. I think they can all look different. Um, and I like to give people the benefit of the doubt where I think most people are sincere, at least whenever I have listened to them share their stories and perspectives. But we as human beings, we are complex, and there can be that temptation, which is what I said to you before about me. I want to check my motives and not be quick to jump ship, because I know very rightly that life outside the church in many ways seems appealing. You know, yes, it would be devastating leaving the church because it's a big part of who I am and my life. But like, for example, during COVID, I didn't really miss church that much, and I think it can be complex. But for the most part, I believe that people do have sincere issues and things they're struggling with, and what might be a big issue to me might not be to someone else, and what's a big issue to them, I might think it's not a big issue to me, and we all process things differently.
Yeah, that's been that's been something that I've had to learn over the years, is we don't all deal with the same struggles. And so when we think of like a faith crisis, I used to read like Rough Stone Rolling, and I'd think, well, everybody who's leaving the church is leaving because of this book, or leaving because of some of the claims in the book about Joseph Smith's history. And so it's like, okay, well, then it's all problems with history. Everybody who's leaving the church is leaving because of history.
Yeah.
And that's not true. There are people who are totally fine with the history, who don't care whether he had a seer stone in a hat or the Urim and Thummim or whatever. And I've been clear on my channel about how I feel about some of these things. I've had Hannah Stoddard on from the Joseph Smith Foundation, who is very adamant about her position, and I appreciate her passion for it. And I agree with some of the positions that they've taken to a degree, but I I also recognize that most of the things I kind of lean towards in her direction or their direction are things that I just don't really care about one way or the other anyway, because it's not a problem for me. But
Yeah.
there are people who very much struggle with the idea of a seer stone in a hat versus the Urim and Thummim, or who
Yeah.
struggle with the polygamy and things like that. And so,
I
um,
think it's important to not. I remember I once had an apologetic friend. We were talking about the seer stone, and we were actually talking about the Stoddards, and I brought up, well, some people might be troubled by the implication if you use the same seer stone in treasure digging, and there's some sources that might point to, was that, fraudulent or not? And he was just kind of like, oh, that's not even an issue, and just dismissed it. And I remember at the time feeling like, well, it might not be an issue to you, but to someone else, they might really struggle with that. And even for myself, I remember the first faith crisis I actually went through, and I won't go into personal details, but it was as a missionary, and it was about a spiritual confirmation I thought I had about a young woman, which she turned out to marry someone else. And looking back, even though it was nothing to do with church history, it was a big faith crisis for, about a week, where I was really questioning, God, and like, was he speaking to me? I thought that was a spiritual answer. Does that call into question my spiritual experiences about like the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith? And although I didn't think of the words "I'm having a faith crisis," that was exactly what was happening to me. So people can experience different, you know times in their life, or different things can cause them to really have a faith struggle. Yeah, and it's not always necessarily has to be to do with church history.
so yeah, that's a very important point. Your spiritual experience, or your confirmation that you had, ended up being incorrect. Um, but it
Either
had nothing
incorrect,
to
or
do.
there's different perspectives.
Oh, sure.
You could either conclude it was incorrect, or somebody might say you just weren't faithful enough or worthy enough, or that maybe you had spiritual experiences but you misinterpreted them. She had agency, and you sort of misinterpreted what might have seemed like answers to prayer. But yes, for all intents and purposes, you could say that I was wrong.
It ended up not being fulfilled in the manner that you had thought.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but that had nothing to do with any of the truth claims of the church. That was your own personal spiritual confirmation of something outside of church history, outside of um, what we would consider like the doctrines of the church, the teachings of the church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so this brings up kind of a question about spiritual experiences and truth claims of people inside and outside the church. There's this idea that I think uh, Latter Day Saints have, or have had for a very long time, and I think it's more cultural than doctrinal. It's not doctrinal at all, but it's certainly a cultural aspect of the church. Is we believe that because we are the one true church, we have the priesthood, we have prophets, that we're the only ones who are entitled to spiritual experiences or to receive spiritual truth and knowledge
Yeah.
from God. And I think when I was a kid, I may have leaned into that and believed that. But certainly by the time I was on my mission, I could recognize that's not the case.
Yeah.
And so there are people who I met throughout my life who have had very strong promptings of the Spirit and spiritual experiences that they've had, who are not members of the church. They are members of other faiths, or maybe not necessarily a member of any church, but have had spiritual experiences teaching them things about their relationship with God.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the response that a lot of people have when they hear that someone has had an experience, or a spiritual experience, or received some sort of spiritual confirmation of something in their life, that what they're saying is, well, then the church is not true because you had that experience outside of the church.
Right. Yeah.
And
Because if you were to have a spiritual experience, it would be God telling you, go join the LDS church. That's my true church.
right, that's kind of the one dimensional view I think that we sometimes have, is if any spiritual experiences were to be had by someone, it would be to point them to getting baptized in the true church, right?
Yeah. And it might challenge or undermine our spiritual experiences if they're claiming theirs.
Right. And one of the things that I really loved that Jim Bennett had discussed on your channel and other channels as well is when he was on John Delin's program, and they brought up this question. Well, what do you say about people who have claimed to have spiritual witnesses or experiences not not in the church or outside of the church or what have you? And his response is just so wonderful. I think it um I think it sums up how I feel about things now, um,
Yeah.
which is great. I'm glad people are having spiritual experiences with the Lord. That's that's the point of having a spiritual experience, is to bring us closer in relationship to God.
Yeah.
And so I don't see that as an attack against the truth claims of the church, but rather a stepping stone on their own personal journey back to God.
Yeah.
And I think this is something we're starting to get over, but is still kind of inherent in the really, really orthodox viewpoint of the church, that you can't truly have a real, authentic spiritual experience outside the church. Or if you
Yeah.
do, then it's a spiritual experience that's pointing you to the church. I
Yes.
don't necessarily think that that's correct. I think spiritual experiences are meant to point us to truth. And anytime that the truth is being taught, or that the truth is being presented to someone, it can be confirmed by the Spirit.
Yeah. No, I agree and resonate with that. And I think one of the shifts in my view now, as opposed to whenever I was like a missionary or more TBM, is I probably would have had that view of spiritual experiences. They're maybe only valid if they are to do with the church, or they definitely couldn't contradict. Like God couldn't be telling you that your religion is where He wants you to be. And I think I've become a lot more, one, just like humble about my own faith and my own spiritual experiences. I don't view them as I absolutely know. And I also try not to convince other people of, because I've had this spiritual experience, I feel like God has given me this answer. Therefore, your spiritual experience must align with mine. I don't try to use that. Some people almost weaponize their testimony sometimes to beat you over the head with it, and you must believe the same as me because God has told me it's true. And people have to, make their own spiritual decisions based on their own relationship with God and what they feel are He's speaking or revealing to them, what answers they're getting. And yeah, critics might say, well, it's all subjective, and how could God be giving people different answers? And it just makes more sense. It's just, people's own, psychology, or it's all in their brain. And you could, take that perspective, but I'm a believer, and I feel like I've seen, you know, experiences where people have had profound answers to prayers and miracles have happened, and it's hard to just explain those away in a natural way. But it's complex, and I try not to claim to know the mind and will of God. And sometimes there's probably so much that I don't fully understand. Everything's a lot bigger than what my brain or my experience can comprehend, and it can be sort of unsettling. But I'm growing to become more comfortable with that.
Yeah, as am I. It's been a long journey. I've had to do a lot of, you know, kind of digging and personal study and development. But I'm realizing as I get older and as I talk to more people that we have very different spiritual experiences, even inside the church.
Yeah,
And to expect that if you're inside the church and you have the wholeness of the complete truth of the gospel as restored through Joseph Smith, and that we're all operating with the same spiritual experience, and that's not the case at all.
yeah. It's almost
And
like you put in money, into like a vending machine, and you put in the money, and then you get what you're looking to get. You get the same blessing or the same answer, and I just don't see that God works that way.
no, it to me it goes all back to this line upon line uh sort of teaching in the scriptures that um God will allow us to struggle with things and go through experiences that he thinks are going to be the most beneficial for us in the long run. And that's hard for some people to hear, and that's even harder for people to accept when you're going through something that's difficult. But keeping the focus on God and recognizing that He can use whatever we're going through for our benefit and for our own good if we let Him. And understanding that this is kind of that line upon line process. Little by little, we're being purged of, our blemishes, and we're being purged of the things that are maybe not in line with God, and through this faith process, this journey towards Him, little by little, we're being shaped and molded. And one of the ways that I really love from Isaiah is the Lord is like a refiner's fire and a purifier of silver. He wants us to eventually return to live with Him, and He wants us to be with Him and to enjoy all the blessings that He has. But we can't do that in our current state. There has to be a journey, and along the way, we have to be willing to peel back the layers of debris and chaff until we can be perfected in Christ. And this is a journey. This isn't a one-stop. This isn't a one-stop shop to have a spiritual experience, and then boom, it's a single event, and now we're perfected, and that's it. We know everything, and now we're going to heaven. It's a long journey, and our journeys are going to be very different. But as long as our journey is pointed in the same direction, and we're trying to follow the spiritual light and knowledge that we've been given, then more can be added upon. And I think that's the best way that I can kind of understand, and try to recognize that not everybody's going to have the same spiritual experiences that I do, or have the same understanding about certain doctrines or church history things that I do. And we're all just trying to do the best we can with what light knowledge we have.
I think so. I like to try to give most people the benefit of the doubt, because the way I see it is, Jesus says, judge not that you be not judged. We can't help but make judgments sometimes, but I like to give people the benefit of the doubt most of the time, in case I'm wrong, judging them. And that I think most people are trying to do the best they can with sincerity. Even critics, I think they're going off, as you said, about the light knowledge that they feel like they have, and their own understanding and the way they view things. And people have different life experiences and come to different conclusions, sometimes looking at the same information. That's something that's been kind of eye-opening for me as I've been going down this journey, where I've almost had more empathy and understanding to critics, and I can see their perspective. And I also have empathy and understanding to faithful believers and apologists. And in some ways, I kind of see the faith struggles I've had, either as it's part of the plan or journey, or it's all things can work for your good. That sort of scripture, that even if you encounter trials or things that can challenge your faith, that God can use it for good. And one of those, I think, blessings I've had from it is being able to understand and empathize with people. And I also feel like it's just something that I almost feel is a bit inevitable for me to encounter, particularly us in the information age. It seems like our generation, it's if you don't encounter critical information about the church at some point in your life, like if it hasn't happened yet, it probably will, whether it's a friend or a family member or something coming up in a social media post or something on YouTube. Like, it sort of seems like it's hard to avoid those things. And I'm not saying that it was part of God's plan for me to leave the church and lose my faith. I do feel like that was partly my decision, but I also felt it was part of my journey. And at the time, I felt like that's what I needed to do. Just the way I was navigating my way through things. But I think if people, if they do leave the church, if they do lose their faith, if they come to the conclusion it's not true, I think just having respect and love and empathy and compassion for them, You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to even want to hear all of their issues or concerns. But everyone's on a faith journey, and for all you know, they could have an experience that brings them back to the church at some point, and they won't appreciate it if you've been judging them or condemning them, calling them apostate, calling them, deceived or sinful. Because I know I got some of those things, and they're kind of hurtful, especially when you feel like it was sincere reasons that you had your faith struggles, and ultimately the, my belief is only God really knows people's intents and their hearts and what they're going through. And if you're a Latter-day Saint who believe that we're all children of God and brothers and sisters, I think we should just have more kindness and understanding. And if somebody leaves the church and you believe that they're sort of spiritually lost, well, you can take comfort that you believe in a savior they're not lost to him, and that he'll try to find them, he'll try to bring them back, whether it happens in this life or in the next. So that's sort of my thoughts on not maybe labeling and judging those people who leave or who have doubts. And in turn, because I did that whenever I was at TBM, I didn't understand those people who struggled with their testimony. And now I feel like I went through this and I realized that it's not always just because people are really weak or sinful, and to have more compassion and understanding towards them.
I think you'll always have some individuals who are operating in bad faith, but that's not the majority. I found those to be few and far between.
Yeah.
I think most people that I've ever come across who really struggle with certain things or have left the church do so because they have serious and honest doubts.
Yeah.
And they're trying to work things through. And sometimes I think they go off on their own journey and kind of just set the gospel aside and
Yeah.
say, well, I'm just going to go focus on career, school. I'm going to focus on other things in my life. I'm not going to think about the church. I'm not going to think about anything in a spiritual context. I'm going to
Yeah.
leave it alone, and maybe someday I'll revisit it. And I think the only real tragedy here occurs when we members of the church who you rightly pointed out believe in the saving grace of Jesus Christ are the ones doing the pushing out the door.
Yeah.
I think so. This brings up what you were talking about. This how we use the terms apostate, anti-Mormon. We have some of these pejorative terms that we use for people who are maybe critical of the church or who are struggling in some way.
Which are quite polarizing and divisive.
Right. Do you see it as ever appropriate to use some of these terms? Are there appropriate times that we can use them, or do you kind of generally refrain from using some of those terms?
I think I suppose they can be appropriate, and I think a lot of it depends on definitions. If you define an anti-Mormon as somebody who's critical or against the church, that's fine. If you define anti-Mormon as somebody who's a liar and just hostile and really angry, then somebody may not fit the definition of that. But I think I personally lean towards I don't appreciate those labels. And there was even a BYU devotional by President Nelson where he talked about not using labels as much, because I see it as they can divide a lot. And I think about in 3rd Nephi, when the Savior visits the Nephites, and it talked about how there was like no manner of ites because they are like perfectly sort of united together. And I recognize it's naive. We're not all going to be united. There's people who are going to leave the church, who are going to have issues, who are going to be critical. And we're going to disagree and we can't all be united. But I think that we could try to emulate respect and understanding sometimes, to not be so divided, because the people that can be critics or have issues with the church can be our friends and family members. And what I find in my experience since doing my channel and having talked to different voices, different people on different spectrums, when you're talking with someone and you're really hearing either their story, their perspectives, or getting to know them, it's hard to just label them as, a wolf in sheep's clothing, or, I'm a sheep and you're a goat, or you see them as a person, with real a different perspective, different take on things. And yeah, I think maybe at times it's appropriate, but I tend to refrain from putting those labels on people.
I would even say that I think even the people who might be traditionally labeled as apostates or anti-Mormon, um, I think most of it we could more accurately term as critics or critics of the church.
That's how I tend to
Um,
call them. I
I
tend to lump them
think
together as critics.
I think there are anti-Mormons out there. I've met them. They're not
Yeah,
pleasant people to be around.
no, for sure.
Um,
I know I get them sometimes commenting on my channel, and they can just be obnoxious and rude and kind of hostile and flippant. And yeah, I remember I watched a TikTok video of a friend of mine, and the person was attacking him and saying that he never went through a faith crisis. He's a liar. And there is a similar video they had mocking the temple ceremony. And the only word I could think to describe that is toxic anti-Mormonism. Like they
yeah.
fit the label. And I don't like to judge or label people, but I knew like what they're doing is disrespectful and wrong. And just I also saw like just lies. And so I think at times the label does fit. But I think the majority that I've had dialogue with are usually um, good people, and sometimes I think anger or frustration or resentment can be a way to cover maybe pain or sadness people have as well. Sometimes it can be a cover.
Well, if we have family members or friends that we really care about who are struggling or who leave the church, it's painful.
Yeah,
We may want to just reach out to them and kind of if we could just upload our memories and our spiritual experiences into their brain and they could uh
yeah,
just kind of overcome whatever it is they're struggling with. If I could download uh my knowledge and whatever to them, then they'll come back to the church and everything will be fine.
yeah.
um and that can't happen. We can't do that. And
Doesn't
so
work.
it hurts and you feel like in some respects like maybe it's your fault that they left the church.
Yeah,
um Maybe you didn't try hard enough to share your testimony with them. Maybe you didn't do enough um to kind of fellowship them, where you didn't do enough to support them uh in having spiritual experiences of their own. And so when it comes time that they decide to leave, you're left feeling like you didn't do enough. And that hurts. And maybe that's just the way we sometimes perceive things, but isn't necessarily true. Because I think a lot of
yeah,
times it doesn't really have as much to do with what you did or didn't do to help them, so much as it's just something that they're going to struggle with until they can find a resolution, whichever direction that is. And
yeah,
um, but to on the other side of the coin, what is it that we can do better when we have a friend or family member who is struggling with something? We're not going to call them, you know, anti-Mormons. We're not going to call them apostates. We're not going to attack them for being spiritually weak or sinful. Um, if we can set those things aside and not engage in that kind of
yeah.
rhetoric, what is it we can do that will have a positive effect?
That's such a good question.
This is, I think,
Because
what
I think,
we're
oh,
struggling
sorry.
with the most right now as a church.
Yeah,
Is I think we're trying really hard right now President Nelson is trying really hard for us to abstain from labeling people and abstain from attacking people in that manner. And but then that still leaves the question, well, then what do we do to actually help them through their faith crisis?
Yeah, because there's still this fear and still messages that, to stay away from maybe critical voices or those people have doubts because you may be influenced by them. And that's, you will probably find if you listen to someone who has serious questions or issues, that if you are open-minded to want to hearing them, the reality is some of the issues they present may become questions or issues for yourself. And that's why I think there can be a tendency of, oh, they've left the church, I don't really want to talk to them about it because I want to protect my own faith. And I totally understand that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with feeling that way. If you do want to have a dialogue with them or a discussion or listen, I think it's important to, I think, first of all, just listen to what they're saying, and don't feel like you have to be the apologist in that moment and answer every single concern they have. A lot of the time, same for me whenever I first left, you just want to vent. And sometimes they just want to vent. When appropriate, you could say, well, maybe what about there's maybe this perspective. But I think sometimes just listening, validating, saying, I understand why you feel that way, I understand you coming to this conclusion, not necessarily having to validate that they've made the right decision, but just listening and understanding them. I think, and we're very tempted to do it, but when people have shared with me their spiritual experiences as a way to almost weaponize them, I've left the church and then they call me on the phone and it's like 30 minutes of them just bearing their testimony at me and just beating me over the head. That actually causes people to push away more. And I think if you are going to share sort of answers or spiritual experiences, it should be when you feel very led or prompted to do it, or if they are asking. Because if they're in a space where they don't want to hear it, it might do more harm than good. And I think just continuing to just love them, and to try your best not to let it affect your relationship. And I've got friends and family members who have left, and our relationships aren't perfect. And there's times where they might be a bit frustrated or hostile, and it's maybe this conversation isn't going a great way. That's going to happen. But I think if you can get to the point where you can talk about things in a respectful way that doesn't impact your relationship, I think that's the most important thing. And usually if you can both listen to each other and be understanding and be willing to hear the other person's perspectives, but not just trying to convince the other person, I'm right and you must believe the same way I do. I think if you go in with that mentality, it will create the us versus them, which won't really help anything. And ultimately, if they do leave, that's their own decision. They're on their journey, and the only person or thing that will convince them should be God and their own personal connection and relationship with Him.
I don't know that I could add anything to that. I think the big takeaway for me is being a better listener. Not feeling like I have to jump in and be the apologist and answer every concern or question.
Yeah.
But just being kind of a support or a shoulder to cry on or an ear to listen. And that's something I think we could do better at. That's something I could do better at. I did want to ask you before we kind of wrap up. You've had on a number of guests.
Yeah.
And we've mentioned several of them already. Do you have a personal favorite interview that you've done? Or do you have maybe some bits of information or things that you've learned along the way from these interviews that has really stuck with you?
Oh, it's such a good question. I don't think I can pick a favorite interview because I found so many of the interviews I've had just uh really amazing and insightful. And I can honestly say I've not had one bad interview. I don't think all of them I feel like have gone well. Um, I really enjoyed the one I did with Stephen Harper. I thought it was great. I felt yeah, just his perspectives. I felt he was very thoughtful, great historian, great scholar. I also found him very validating and kind to the questions I was asking because I was asking him tough questions as well. A lot of the questions that critics would bring up. And that's the thing, like if I'm going to bring on a scholar or a historian, I want to talk about the faithful side, but I don't want to beat around the bush. And let's get to the hard questions. And
Right. You don't want to throw in
even
a
if
bunch of
somebody's not,
softballs.
yeah, like and I feel like if there's some channels that may want to go that way, but I feel like where I'm at, and for my listeners who are really struggling with the tough questions, I feel like I want to get their perspective on it. And um, even if someone didn't feel like they were fully convinced by all of his answers, it was the fact he was providing answers and you didn't feel judged or you're asking the wrong questions. And he would often say, great question. And he was very, I think, humble in his approach sometimes, and that's one thing I've just found amazing is to be able to connect with people who can at least validate the questions you're asking. That's a good question. That's a big issue. This is complex, and they can show a bit of empathy. And these are people who are sort of scholars and experts on some of these things. And I think that's just been a really rewarding part as well about like it's okay to have questions and it's important to reach out to people you can turn to for support or hear their perspectives or how they make sense of the issues. And they might provide insights or information that maybe you hadn't considered or might be new to you that may help to resolve an issue. Um, but yeah, so much of that. And I think one of the takeaways I've had from my channel is to be critically minded. And that's not to criticize, but to be critical of the information on both sides, to be careful with the facts, careful with the sources, try to look, is this just spin? Is this just their interpretation? And for most issues, yes, there's facts, but there can be different interpretations. Sometimes people can draw as well. And what I'm striving to do is for every maybe critical piece of a book or an article or a podcast I listen to try to balance it out with faithful one as well, so you're not being heavily influenced by one side.
Yeah, you do a really good job of asking hard questions that I know many critics of the church or those who are struggling will have.
Yeah,
Um, but also allowing the apologetics to kind of speak for itself and allow the answers, as satisfactory or as unsatisfactory as those answers might be, allow them room to breathe. And
yeah.
I think you've done a really good job of providing both sides of that. Which is really why I wanted to have you on, is because I feel like you are someone who's been, um, your channel is only what, a year old, or
It's been
is it
about
even a year?
7 months since I
Okay,
started in July, so just over half a year.
so not that old. You have already spoken to so many different people on a wide variety of subjects, and your approach has been so consistent, um, with every interview. Um, One of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with, on both sides of the faith crisis, issues, are the personalities of the individuals who are providing the apologetics for their side. And what I mean by
Yeah,
that is it's very easy for someone like me, who is a true believing member, to look at someone like, let's say, John Dehlin, and I'll use him as an example because he's a very well known, critic of the church. Someone like me might look at him and say, um, he's an anti Mormon. He hates the church. He's trying to lead everyone out of the church.
yeah,
And I think there's some truth to that insofar as I think he brings up questions to stir things up a bit and
Sure.
kind of stir the pot a little bit. And um but to me it really comes down to his personality and his approach to asking the questions.
Hmm.
You if you had Stephen Harper on and you were interviewing him and John DeLynn was interviewing him, you two would have very different approaches to how you would ask your questions, even if the questions were the same.
Right.
And I think
Yeah. A lot of it's how you
what
ask it.
what turns people off so much from both sides is that a very overly aggressive, almost abrasive approach to like finger pointing approach to your apologetics. And it turns people off. It turns me off when I see people even in the church who are very overbearing of like, well, this is the way it is. And if you don't agree 100%, then you're an apostate. And they get
Yeah.
very
I don't like that
aggressive about
either.
it. And it's like, no, I'm just asking questions because I'm trying to understand. And then on this other hand, you have people outside of the church who are critics who are very aggressive and overbearing. And you're like,
Yeah.
well, you're just like it. You're just basically evil. You're what you're doing is just straight up evil because you're aggressively trying to get people to leave the church.
Yeah.
And it's really for me has boiled down to just the approach and finding voices on the internet who are more calm and level headed and are willing to tackle some of the difficult questions in a thoughtful and humble way has been increasingly difficult over the years. And so it's so refreshing when I see a channel like yours who is doing that.
Well, I appreciate that. I think people have different personalities. I think I'm more of a calm, sort of relaxed person. I'm not argumentative. That's not really my personality. I've always been kind of a peacemaker. Um, and also I think not that I think emotions are bad necessarily or to get sort of riled up, but I do find that sometimes it can influence people. Um, how they say things, using emotion. You can frame questions in a way that can seem attackive, or the way you interpret something, you can be very suggestive to your audience. The only logical interpretation is this one, or you are stupid if you think how a critic thinks, or you're stupid if you side with the apologetics on this. And it can be very influential, and that's something that I don't overly want to do too much. Obviously, at times I'll probably interject my thoughts. I'm not a robot, but I'm striving to do, no matter where I'm at in my own faith journey and the way I interpret things, to try to be kind of neutral and objective and not to get too emotional about things. So I can be level-headed, so I can be objective and not influence my listeners too much and let them come to their own conclusions on it. And yeah, there's times where I've seen both sides, as you said, can sometimes be guilty of it. And I don't think it's always, in my opinion, the best approach.
Yeah, and to those who may be new to my channel or new to your channel, I think I think I've been a little bit judgmental at times. Even on my channel, I think I've allowed my emotions to get the better of me, and I'm trying to be better about that. But that's always going to be the struggle, I think, is how we approach the gospel of Jesus Christ and how we approach the hard topics and the questions
Mm-hmm.
will have a bigger impact than the questions themselves almost. Um, and to go back to your answer about how do we help people through their own faith struggles, um, the approach is what makes all the difference, I think, rather
Yeah.
than just having an answer for everything, even if the answer you provide is correct and true. um, the approach is what makes all the difference, and that's something that we're, I think, just now kind of starting to recognize, I think.
Yeah. No, I think, and that's the difference. Like ministering, I think it's a huge part of that. And I kind of think, what would Jesus do if someone's in a faith crisis? And you might think, well, he's the Son of God, so he would just heal them and just be like, believe in me. But what would Jesus have me do? I feel like he would just want us to show compassion to them, not judge them. Try to just love them and try to do what he would do. And you know, maybe someone is just a hostile, judgmental person. Maybe they do have not good motives for them criticizing the church. But I kind of see it as it's not for me to label them as that. I don't know their full story and their full experiences. Um, and it's important, obviously, to be wise and use discernment sometimes, and not be naive that everyone's always got good motives. But and I try to focus more on the information and evidence rather than attacking the person, because I've seen that critics smearing apologists and apologists smearing critics, and it's a very easy way to just dismiss what they're saying. And I like to listen to what people say.
And I think part of that is asking them good follow-up questions. If someone has legitimate questions and concerns that have caused some doubt, um, listening to them sort of um, explain how they feel about things and what they've thought um, will provide you with the information you need to know to ask good follow-up questions.
Yeah.
And to because sometimes I feel like a lot of the questions that come from critics who maybe do so in a more aggressive way, they will kind of spin a question, or they'll ask a question in a certain way that is aggressive or that seems accusatory.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and if you can kind of ask them back to clarify certain things about their questions, and if you can
Mm-hmm.
ask, basically, if we can kind of break down the question to its core component, what
Sure.
is the
Yeah.
core of their concern, the core of their question, and let's kind of break away the accusation for a minute. Let's set the accusation aside. Let's get to the core of the concern,
Mm-hmm.
and let's ask questions about that and have a dialogue about that. It's a little more disarming. And um it I can only think of a couple of times on my mission where um I've had experiences of talking to people who were very um angry at the church for something, and most of them were evangelicals who are not members of the church but who had been taught things about the church that were maybe half truths or slight mischaracterizations about something in church history, but
Yeah.
they attack you in a very accusatory way. And uh, I've been in the position of someone who feels the attack and wants to go on the defensive. And
Yeah.
I have those experiences to tell me sometimes that's not the right approach.
No.
Sometimes if I can hear their attacks, the accusations, and then just sit back for a second, let them vent, and then let them get it out.
Yeah.
They'll run themselves out of arguments if you let them talk for a few minutes and just let them get it all off their chest. Eventually, there will be nothing else for them to say, and now you can just take a deep breath and then just ask them to clarify a few things about their questions and concerns. And if we can do that, I think that's a little disarming. They feel like, oh, okay, I can let my guard down a little bit and not have to be so aggressive because this person's actually going to listen.
Yeah. It's
Um,
not. It's not a debate. It's not a fight.
right. I've been in those. I've been in so many of those on my mission, and it always
Yeah.
goes
Same.
nowhere.
Yeah.
Um,
You just leave
and
frustrated and annoyed.
I'll tell you a personal experience, and then what we got to wrap up. But
Yeah. I've got to
um,
go in a couple of minutes.
I had an experience on my mission. I lived in a particular area that was very heavily populated with evangelicals who attended a pretty big, well-known church, and they held anti-Mormon classes. And I use the term anti-Mormon specifically because that's what they used.
Yeah.
um, where they produced pamphlets and materials like, that were antagonistic to the church, or to prepare their members on what to do and say to handle, um, what happens when a Mormon missionaries come to your door.
It's
What do you say
crazy,
to
isn't it, that
them?
other churches do that? Like, because although sometimes there might be the odd condescending comment made at church about, other churches, we don't try to belittle or invalidate or
Right.
take down other churches and their beliefs.
Yeah, it's very strange that as a church you would spend time and money producing materials that are against another belief system.
Yeah.
Um, I, I I find it strange, but in any case, we had been tracting. We ran into somebody who let us in the door, and we thought we were going to have a nice conversation with them. And as soon as we kind of got into the conversation, it turned very quickly and became an attack. And as a missionary, you feel very blindsided
Yeah.
sometimes. So, like, you know right away with people when you knock on their door if they're interested or if they're not. But when someone invites you in acting as if they're interested and then immediately turns around and starts attacking you, it's very frustrating, and you feel it like almost kind of in your gut, like you have to start being defensive now. You're being attacked, and
Yeah.
this had happened a number of times on my mission. And this one particular time, it had been a very long day. We had already dealt with many people that day who were critics of the church in this particular neighborhood. And the pastor of the church uh, lived down that street. We had ran into him a couple days earlier and had a whole um, a, a bashing session, I guess, with him, and very very bad experience with him. And so, here it is a couple days later. We're kind of on the other end of the street, and we're running into people who are members of his congregation, and it's the same arguments every door. And it's like, okay, you're all reading the same pamphlets, right? Because you're all asking the same questions in the same way. We finally ran into this house who let us in and acted like they wanted to have a conversation and be cordial. And she immediately started attacking us, not with the pamphlet information, but she had a friend who joined the church and who was getting ready to go through the temple for the first time, to do baptisms. And it came up in conversation with her friend that as part of the baptismal interview questions, for the temple recommend, is, do you pay your tithing and things like that. And um, her takeaway was, oh, so this is all about money. You took my friend in and are like cheering her on to go through the faith steps of your church, but when it comes down to it, it's all about money. And that led into a discussion about tithing, which then eventually led into a discussion about um, the temple and the purpose of the temple and temple baptisms, because her friend was a faithful convert to the church,
Right.
who was excited to go through the temple and start doing proxy baptisms. And here we're talking to her friend who um, who interpreted what was happening with her friend as she had been conned. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
she's being very defensive of her friend. And but what
And
came
probably out of good
across,
intentions to an extent.
sure, I think that's true. Um I think she saw her friend being conned by the church into, well, you just want another member because you want money. To, well, what do you need temples for anyway? She's an evangelical. They don't believe in the necessity of temples,
Right.
um, and she doesn't believe in the authority of the church to provide ordinances and ordinance work. And so the whole thing's a sham, and her friend's just been duped. And So here she is confronting two of the young men who are representatives of that sham. And she went through attack after attack of all these different topics. And it finally got to the end of the discussion where we were just not getting anywhere. She was not letting her guard down at all. And we were being very defensive. And one of the regrets that I have on my mission, this is one of the few regrets I have on my mission, and in life, really. I left that house and I told her, I will see you at the judgment bar of God when you will know that I was right and you were wrong. That's what I told her. I can feel it right now in my throat. That that was the wrong approach. Um, sorry. Do I believe that the truth claims of the church are ultimately correct? Yes, I do. I believe in the church. I believe in the fundamental truth claims of the church. But I can recognize all these years later that that approach was the wrong way to go about it, and I don't think it helped her in any way. In fact, I think it closed her off even more. Now she has an impression of those who are supposed to be representatives of Jesus Christ telling her that she's wrong and she's going to be judged for it. Ultimately, that judgment is between her and God, but I had to insert myself into that somehow as I left her doorstep, and it's caused a lot of reflection over the years of how I could have handled that better. And in the moment, you get so worked up and defensive of your worldview.
Yeah.
And ultimately, as I said, I still believe that the doctrines we were teaching her and the answers that we were providing for her questions were ultimately correct. It's the approach, and I know that. And here's the irony. I believe that I will see her again at the judgment bar of God, but not because of the discussion and the disagreement that we had with her, but I will have to see her because of that comment that I made to her about seeing her at the judgment bar. And I will have to, I feel in my heart, I will at some point have to see her and apologize to her for that comment, because I believe it was made not by the Spirit, but out of a feeling of defensiveness and contention.
Yeah.
So that's the irony of it, as I do believe that will come to fruition. I will see her again on the other side, but it will be to apologize.
Yeah.
So I don't want to totally wrap up on a dour note, but
I think most missionaries, I've had experiences similar to that where I've probably been defensive, or maybe I read too much of Nephi. It reminded me of Second Nephi 33, that like, these are the words of Christ, and if they're not, I'll see you at the judgment bar of God. And you can get very very overzealous and defensive as well, and you kind of feel like you're a representative of Jesus Christ, and you almost have the right to almost rebuke someone and almost condemn them in a sense. If you're rejecting me, you're rejecting Christ. I think I don't think you're alone with having an experience like that, but I think it's good to reflect on them, and that's maybe probably not the best approach. Sometimes we look at Jesus, and Jesus rebuked people and he flipped tables, and we can do the same, but we're not Jesus. And I think of scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants talk about, like, if you have, like, to be meek and have meek and kind and soft language, maybe at times you need to be bold and you need to be courageous, and you may feel impressed to rebuke or use stronger words, but in general, I think to be meek and humble and use edifying language is probably the approach I would think the Savior would want us to use.
and the more I've studied things out and reflected on some of my experiences, um, like, yeah, Jesus flipped tables, he rebuked people, um, but almost in every instance I can think of, it was only when necessary and in public settings when he was trying to establish the truth in a public setting. Anytime that he was in conversation with people, almost on a one-to-one basis, um, he was compassionate and caring, and there's a difference between ministering to the one and declaring truth to the public.
Yeah.
And I think the better the more we can learn how to differentiate when it's appropriate to declare things and to make our position, um, boldly state our position, and how we go about doing that in a public setting versus a private setting, I think makes a big difference. Um, and as far as I can tell, Jesus is ultimately the one um, who we have to go through. Um, and so our faith and repentance should be turning to Him, not to anyone else. And so I think the overall message, I think, today of this podcast is learning how to discern the best approach and being a better listener for people who struggle, and reaching out in empathy, and not becoming defensive when people struggle, but being a shoulder of support.
I agree.
Well, I know you have to go. I have to get going as well. But I really enjoyed our conversation. I'd love to have you back in the
Yeah, me
future,
too. It
and
was
maybe
great.
we can have a discussion about a more specific topic.
Sure.
Or I know I did all the real question asking today, but if you ever wanted, you could ask me all sorts of questions about what my positions are and things. That'd be cool too.
Yeah, I'll bring you onto my channel.
Sure.
That could be fun.
But I want to give everybody a chance to find you. You are on Mormonism with the Murph is your channel name. You
Yeah,
tackle a lot of difficult, controversial topics in church history and church doctrine, and you ask a lot of thoughtful questions along the way. And I want to point everybody to your channel, to give them a chance to listen to some of the great conversations that you've had along the way. And
thank you.
I would encourage everybody to go check out his channel. I would encourage everybody to like this episode of the podcast today and share it with others. I know there's a lot of people who are struggling with their testimonies, or who are struggling with certain aspects of the gospel or the church. And if we can share some of these approaches with each other, and how to best empathize and reach out to people, the better off we will all be for it. So if you feel prompted to, please share this episode with somebody that you think might benefit. And until next time, is there any other things that you'd like to say before we get going? Or
No, I think this has been a great episode. I've really enjoyed talking about just faith crisis in general, and what we can do if you're in a faith crisis or somebody who has one. And I think just reaching out to people, I think community and support is important, and awareness and understanding to those who are going through it. So no, I've just appreciated you having me on for this discussion.
yeah, thank you for coming on. We'll do this again sometime in the hopefully not too distant future.
Awesome.